The Canadian suburbs near Toronto have always seemed too peaceful for Sabrina. The girl grew up among carefully maintained homes, narrow streets with trees lining the roadsides, and flowering flower beds that families were proud of in every yard. This tranquil atmosphere seemed to lull the passion for adventure. Neighbors usually exchanged warm greetings, and in the evening there were few passers-by. Only teenagers could be heard discussing news from school. It was here that a large African-Canadian community lived, characterized by cohesion and mutual support. They attended church together, gathered for family celebrations, and actively participated in the life of the neighborhood. For the families who lived nearby, the church was a center of unity, and Sunday services turned into a warm celebration with sincere hugs, friendly conversations, and shared plans for the future. Sabrina, a 17-year-old girl of African descent, attends high school and trains with the cheerleading team after school. However, she has repeatedly noticed how monotonous her schedule is becoming. Wake up, classes, practice, dinner with her parents, short conversations with her neighbors. This scenario has become very boring for her, and over the past year, she has developed a vague thirst for thrills, a desire to do something unexpected. She wants to prove to everyone, and especially to herself, that she is capable of more than is usually expected of her. Her father, Joshua, used to be a hunter and served in the army, so he has long been instilled with strict discipline and a desire to follow impeccable rules. His mother, Carol, worked as a nurse at a local clinic. She was gentle and caring, always smiling. At least that's how Sabrina saw her. Although the family seemed to be perfect, the girl lacked freedom. Her father was sometimes too strict and harsh, and her mother tried to resolve conflicts by softening any tensions. At times, Sabrina wondered what would change if she could escape from this suburb for at least a day, see something different from everyday life, and feel the real adrenaline. However, these thoughts remained only dreams. Every day she went to school, and in the evening she was back home again. Not far away on the neighboring street, there was a small church where the townspeople usually gathered. This church was actually the center of the community. They celebrated holidays, held charity events, and organized youth gatherings. Recently, a new pastor, Marvin, who was about 35 years old, came to the church. Younger than his predecessor, an elderly priest, he was distinguished by a special charisma. Marvin filled his sermons with examples relevant to young people, often asked unexpected questions to encourage people to think, and tried to make each service more interesting and meaningful. This is how the silence that reigns in a quiet suburb can create the illusion of safety and routine, but at the same time awaken dreams of something extraordinary. Sabrina, with her thirst for adventure, remains hopeful that she will soon have the chance to break out of her usual boundaries and find her own freedom. At the same time, the church, under the leadership of Pastor Marvin, becomes a center of warmth and unexpected change in this seemingly static world. The people around him were talking about him incessantly. Everyone was impressed by his skillful preaching style, his wonderful singing, and his desire to engage the teenagers in various activities. The African-Canadian community, which is well united and open to new initiatives, was especially responsive. Sabrina, who was already tired of her routine life, was suddenly excited by the idea that this young pastor could become her gateway to adventure. Despite being 17 years old, she felt confident enough. As captain of the cheerleaders, she had friends who admired her inexhaustible energy and leadership skills. Sometimes she wanted to break at least some of the prohibitions to prove to herself and others that she was not the model daughter they thought she was. The invisible echo of the drama seemed to hover over the town, although it remained calm and sleepy. No one could have guessed the tragic consequences of Sabrina's thrill-seeking. One day, after a grueling practice, Sabrina stayed in the locker room with her friends Monica, Cara, and Brianna. They were laughing out loud, distracting themselves from their fatigue by talking about the latest school news, rumors, and of course discussing the new pastor, a topic that was on everyone's minds. "Did you see his sermon yesterday?" Monica said, braiding her hair. "He was so reserved, but to be honest, he was attractive at the same time." "Perhaps he's overly pious," Brianna said with an ironic smile. "But I won't hide the fact that he looks impressive." Kiara smiled slyly. I heard somewhere that he's still single. Sabrina listened without saying a word, but her eyes betrayed her interest. She could have immediately added that she too had noticed his charisma, but was waiting for the right moment to make a point or challenge. What if we, Monica began in a mocking mood, try to provoke him somehow? Can you imagine? Such a pious man will not be able to resist. Oh, don't joke, it's a sin. Kiara was outraged. Then Sabrina suddenly spoke up. What sin? Seriously, wouldn't I be able to approach him? The friends looked at each other, not knowing how serious these words were. Sabrina herself was chilled with anticipation of the adventure. She was sure that she could achieve anything if she set her mind to it. Sabrina, Brianna said, you're very brave, but this is a pastor, and he's much older. Sabrina snapped, I don't care if he's a pastor or if he's older. I will show that no one can resist when I set a goal. For a few more minutes, the girls asked each other if she was joking, and gradually it began to look like a bet. Monica squinted, throwing in a gamble. Okay, let's see if you're as desperate as you say you are. An unexpected thought struck Sabrina. What if she actually did this task and got the pastor to pay attention to her? She couldn't explain why she was so eager for this challenge. Perhaps she wanted to feel the adrenaline rush and escape the boring gray circle of everyday life. Imagine, Kiara said with a laugh, the story of the pastor and the schoolgirl. Her words caused a slight tension, although they sounded humorous. Sabrina stood up abruptly, checking to see if her cheerleading uniform had slipped off. Then let's see if nothing is really impossible, she said. Her friends laughed while giving each other meaningful looks. Would the girl dare to do such a crazy thing? They were used to Sabrina's unexpected actions, so they could only wait with interest for her to continue. But deep down, Sabrina herself felt that this could turn into something more serious than just a joke. She suddenly wondered how young Pastor Marvin would be able to remain untouched by temptation and whether he could give her what she was missing in her hometown. On this intriguing note, the day ended. The girls packed their things, talked about their upcoming training, and Sabrina was already mentally building a picture of a possible acquaintance with a too-right pastor. The phrase she had heard in the locker room was still in her mind. I can seduce a pastor. At first, it sounded like groundless bragging, but with each passing hour after class, the idea grew stronger. The longer she thought about it, the more she felt the sweet excitement of the dangerous prospect. On Sunday, Sabrina finally decided to come to church alone, for the first time in a long time, with her friends. The atmosphere was cozy and warm. People hugged each other as they sat closer to each other. Former neighbors greeted each other. Older women asked the younger ones about their studies. Everything was as usual. At that moment, Pastor Marvin, a man of about 35 with penetrating eyes and a confident look typical of someone who is used to addressing large audiences, came to the altar. When he noticed the girls, he smiled at them cautiously and stared intently at the Bible. Sabrina, who was sitting in the second row, felt her heart pounding. She used to think that sermons were too long and boring, but now she could hardly wait to hear Marvin's voice. She looked intently at his features, a high forehead, a dark face with a few wrinkles around the eyes, a confident but warm gaze. Jesus taught us to be merciful, but also to remember our own honor and moral boundaries. The pastor's voice was even, calm, but full of power. Sabrina listened to his words with unexpected attention and thought, he doesn't seem so boring after all. Maybe he really has something special. At the end of the service, when people were either hurrying home or gathered around to discuss what they had heard, Sabrina determinedly walked toward the pastor. Her friends, who had been cheering her on with jokes half an hour earlier, now stepped aside, preferring to stay out of sight. Good afternoon, Pastor, she said, trying not to sound too bold, but not too submissive at the same time. I wanted to tell you that your sermon was very inspiring. Marvin, seeing the confident girl before him, smiled. I'm glad you got something useful out of it. I always want young people to find meaning in their faith. Perhaps you can help me with some questions I have? Her eyes focused on his, looking for that key to gain his trust. With pleasure, he nodded. If you are really interested in spiritual topics, you can join our youth meetings or talk to me personally. Sabrina felt a little triumph inside her. He was open to talking. Great, she said. I really need to sort out a few things in my life. After exchanging a few more short phrases, She realized that his attitude was friendly, but at the same time quite reserved. He looked at her attentively, without any signs of flirting, and this calmness only fueled her excitement. Sabrina knew exactly how to turn on the charm when she wanted to. Soon he took the folder with the notes and said goodbye, and she watched him go with a subtle smile. Her friends who were standing nearby immediately attacked her with questions. "Well, how did you like him?" "We just talked a little," she answered without much emotion, although a cheerful light was already burning in her eyes. Deep down, Sabrina realized that she had already taken the first step towards her plan. A few weeks passed, and the slight flirtation between Sabrina and Pastor Marvin was whispered about among the young people. At first, it was limited to short conversations after church events, when he would stay to answer faith questions, and she would boldly ask more and more frank questions that had long since gone beyond the religious. And yet Marvin saw an intelligent, sometimes unexpectedly mature girl who reflected on the meaning of life and her own doubts. A storm of conflicting feelings gradually arose inside him. On the one hand, he realized that such an affection was not very appropriate. He was a member of the clergy, and she was an underage schoolgirl. But on the other hand, he could not deny that she was attractive, full of young energy, and looked at him with undisguised curiosity and respect. After all, Marvin was also a simple man, not without human weaknesses and desires. One evening when the youth meeting was over and almost everyone had left, Sabrina approached the pastor and said quietly, "I'm so restless today. Can I talk to you?" Marvin looked at her anxiously. It was a bit risky to stay in a half-empty church, but he nodded and asked what was wrong. The girl began to talk about her teenage crises, about feeling as if she had a hard time finding a place in this world. Some of her confessions were true, but others were a bit of an act. She wanted him to be someone who would support her and give her advice, someone she would make special in her life. The conversation lasted for almost an hour. The lights in the church were barely dimmed. Marvin talked about hope, about the meaning of life, quoted from the Bible, and she looked at him as if he were the only guide in the darkness. At one point, wanting to comfort her, he put his hand on her shoulder. Sabrina thought that her heart could be heard in the walls of the temple. It was pounding so hard. "I feel protected. Next to you," she whispered. These words, spoken in the twilight, broke the last barrier. Pastor Marvin, who prided himself on his firmness, allowed himself a brief weakness. He leaned down, touching his forehead to hers as if seeking forgiveness, and touched her lips with his own. It was their first kiss, a mixture of fear, prohibition, and overwhelming passion. After that, their bond, which should have been immediately broken, only grew stronger. At first, the meetings took place on the outskirts of town, in a car near a forest park, in a rented apartment on the outskirts, or even in the church itself when no one else was there. This went on for 3 months, during which this story teetered on the edge between a dizzying fairy tale and a nightmare. They were passionately drawn to each other, but this only made the guilt worse. Sabrina realized that she was taking an irrevocable risk if her father found out. Marvin was tormented by the fact that the community he serves could ruin his reputation and his very life if she found out about his relationship with a minor. "We have to stop this now," he repeated anxiously. "But you can't," she replied with a sad smile as she clung to him. "And neither can I." Because of all this, Sabrina withdrew from her friends. It became difficult for her to talk to them, and she avoided unnecessary chatter after cheerleading in order not to give away secrets. A special glint appeared in her eyes that the girls did not understand, and Marvin suffered from disturbing dreams at night. He would wake up thinking that he had committed a deadly sin and betrayed the trust of those who believed in him as a pastor. At the same time, the longing to see Sabrina again tightened its grip on his heart. This double life was slowly destroying him from the inside, until a premonition of disaster appeared on the horizon. It was too difficult to hide such feelings. Gossip spread in the town. Why does the pastor stay so late in the evening? Someone allegedly saw a girl getting out of his car. Sabrina's friends also noticed that she disappeared just as the events in the church were going on. Every day the fear of being exposed grew, and then something happened that turned everything upside down. Sabrina was pregnant. The girl noticed that she hadn't had her period for the second and then the third week. At first, she reassured herself, maybe it's just stress or the result of exhausting training. But her morning nausea, dizziness, and intolerance to certain smells said otherwise. Her best friend Kiara began to sound the alarm. Are you sure it's not pregnancy? You're not with someone, are you? Sabrina was terrified to admit that the someone was actually the pastor. But she had to at least hint, yes, I have a boyfriend. Maybe we can check it out? The next morning, when her parents left home, she took the test. It clearly showed a positive result. It seemed as if the world had fallen on her head at that moment. She is only 17, still in school. What would her strict father think, who would never forgive her for having a secret affair? And now she's pregnant? In her room, Sabrina hid her face in her hands, as if that would hold back the tears. She was terrified, but she knew she had to tell Marvin. Maybe he could help her figure out what to do next. When they met in his car late one night, somewhere in a remote clearing near a forest park, Sabrina, trembling, handed him a test. I'm pregnant. Marvin immediately turned pale, and his hands trembled slightly. He was silent for a while, barely breathing out. But is it possible? Sabrina felt the tears coming again. What are we going to do? My father will kill me. You see, he's a hunter and a soldier. The pastor leaned on the steering wheel in despair, imagining how the community would find out about his relationship with the minor and her pregnancy. It meant the end of everything, his position, his reputation, possibly his life. Listen, he said quietly, you have to have an abortion, otherwise everything will explode. Sabrina shuddered. She had never thought in her life that she would be faced with such a decision, but her father's fear was even greater. Really, she whispered. We have no alternative, he said firmly. I will lose everything, and so will you. You are too young. You need a life without this burden. Sabrina listened to his words in silence, terrified at the thought of abortion. Yet she lacked the strength to imagine any other way out. Eventually, the tension and fear of disclosure reached its limit. Then something happened that changed everything. Sabrina found herself pregnant. At first, she noticed the absence of her period on the second and then the third week. The girl tried to explain it as stress or the effects of heavy exercise during training. However, constant morning nausea, dizziness, and an aversion to certain smells pointed to something else. Her closest friend, Kiara, did not hide her anxiety. You're not pregnant, are you? You're, well, with someone? Sabrina was terrified at the thought of having to admit it. Someone was the pastor, but she had to at least hint. Maybe it's this guy. Let's check it out, shall we? In the morning, when her parents left the house, she took the test, and it showed 2 stripes unequivocally. It seemed like the world had suddenly fallen on her. She was only 17, a student. Her father, who is strict and demanding, will never forgive a secret affair. And now a pregnancy? Locked in her room, she tried to hold back her tears with her hands over her face, torn by horror and the realization that she would have to tell Marvin. Only he might know a way out. That night they met at the edge of the forest where he had parked his car. Trembling, Sabrina showed him her positive test. I'm pregnant. He was dumbfounded. His face turned pale, and his hands visibly trembled. For a while he was silent, as if he did not believe it. But it's impossible. These words made her tears come again. What should I do? My father is ready to kill me for this. He has weapons and experience. He was a soldier and a hunter. Marvin was desperate, leaning against the steering wheel. He envisioned the community finding out that he had seduced a minor and had a child with her, which meant the complete collapse of his career and reputation. Listen, he said quietly, you need to have an abortion. Otherwise, everything will be ruined. Sabrina shuddered, realizing that she had never even imagined such a decision before. Are you serious? She whispered. There is no other way, the pastor replied insistently. Otherwise, I will lose everything, and so will you. You're still so young. You have to move on. Sabrina listened to these words in silence, her heart clenching inside her at the thought of abortion. But there was no alternative left in her mind. Okay, she sighed, but let's keep it secret. My father cannot find out about it. Deep down, the girl felt that she was betraying not only her dreams but also her own moral compass. However, fear prevailed. A few days later, they went to a small clinic in the countryside in the morning. Marvin sat tensely behind the wheel, and Sabrina could barely contain her panic. She didn't know how painful it would be or how she would live with this act. The operation was done quickly without any questions. Apparently, someone had taken care of the expedited formalities. When Sabrina regained consciousness after anesthesia, it seemed to her that the world had become grayer, as if she had lost a part of herself not only physically, but also internally. Marvin tried to be there for her, saying something comforting, but at the same time he sounded relieved, as if the problem was solved. This annoyed the girl, but she didn't have the strength to argue. At home, Sabrina immediately withdrew into herself. She avoided talking, and when asked questions by her mother, Carol, who worked as a nurse, she just waved them away. Joshua, the father, became more anxious. His military experience suggested that something serious had happened to his daughter. He tried to talk to her. "Sabrina, my daughter, what's wrong? Why are you so depressed? Did someone hurt you?" "Nothing's wrong, Dad," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "I don't believe it. You've been crying and acting strange," he said through clenched teeth. He couldn't stand lies, but she remained stubbornly silent, and at night she had terrible dreams about the clinic and imaginary scenes where her parents would learn the truth. Time passed, and a terrible secret gnawed at her from the inside. Marvin was also acting strangely. He would disappear, wanting to forget everything as soon as possible, and then suddenly write a short, "How are you?" as if he wanted to keep in touch. But they had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Every day, Joshua was more confidently piecing together fragmentary facts, realizing that the cause of his daughter's sadness was very serious. Soon he would extract a confession from her, and this would lead to a tragedy that no one expected. Over the next few weeks, his suspicions only grew stronger. Drawing on his military experience, he could see that Sabrina was not just sad, but seemed to be afraid of her own shadow. As soon as he returned home in the evening, he noticed that her eyes were reddened, or she immediately ran to her room. One night at dinner, my father could not stand it. "Sabrina, I see you have lost weight and are walking like a ghost. What's going on?" "Nothing," she mumbled, not even looking at him. "No," Joshua raised his voice. "I know very well when I'm being deceived. You have to tell me what's going on." Carol, the mother, stood up to defend her daughter. "Maybe she's just having trouble at school." "I wish it were," the father cut her off, "but I can see it's much more serious than that." Sabrina blinked away her tears, carefully put down the cutlery, and suddenly stood up and walked to her room. Carol looked at her husband with concern, and he stared after his daughter. An unbearable silence reigned in the air. The following days became even more tense. The father, who had no patience left, was ready to literally interrogate her friends to find out the truth. But he decided that he had to talk to her privately, without witnesses first. One evening, an argument broke out at home. Joshua had returned from a shooting range or hunting trip and was in a bad mood and told his wife that he wanted to hear his daughter's honest answer right then and there. "I want you to tell me everything about why you cry at night," he said firmly. "Dad, I can't tell you," she sobbed. "You have to," he shouted and slammed his palm on the table, making the dishes clink. His eyes glittered with rage and pain. Carol tried to calm him down by standing between him and Sabrina, but he couldn't hear. He repeated that he had a right to know what was happening to his child. Driven to the brink, Sabrina felt like she was about to explode. Finally, she shouted, "Okay! I was pregnant, and it was him." She swallowed the lump in her throat, tears streaming down her face. "The pastor, we were together and I got pregnant and he made me have an abortion." The room fell eerily silent. Joshua looked at her for a moment, as if he could not comprehend what he had heard, and his mother just pressed her hand to her mouth, unable to say a word. Sabrina continued to sob, confessing, "He seduced me. We were dating, I got pregnant, and he said we had to get rid of him, to keep it a secret." Finally, the meaning of her words dawned on her father. Joshua's face froze like a stone. He pushed back his chair and stood up like a giant, awakened from a dream. You, you mean to tell me that this rascal pastor took my granddaughter from me and disgraced you? Her mother only whispered, "Oh God, why did we have to do this?" And Sabrina could barely stand from exhaustion and tears, feeling like she was about to faint. "I didn't know what to do," she sobbed. But her father was no longer listening. He was completely overcome with rage. Suddenly, Joshua grabbed the car keys, his eyes filled with hatred. Carol rushed to stop him from getting out. "Joshua, stop! Don't do anything stupid!" But he pushed her aside like a madman. "He will pay for what he did to my daughter." Carol begged him in vain to stop. "Don't do anything stupid," she pleaded, but Joshua had already flown out the door, slamming it so hard that it nearly flew off its hinges. At this point, Sabrina lay sobbing on the floor, feeling that she may have just put the pastor in mortal danger with her words. But she could not stop what she had started. That night, Pastor Marvin stayed in church longer than usual. He was hopelessly trying to organize his disturbed mind, to understand how to live with the burden of Sabrina's abortion, an event he perceived as a tragedy, but also saw as a solution. But his conscience nagged at him incessantly. At midnight, as he left the quiet church for the dimly lit street, he thought about the next Sunday sermon, trying to imagine what he would say in front of the congregation, while confusion and shame still raged inside him. Suddenly, he noticed the headlights of a car nearby, which had been parked silently. The door opened, and Joshua stepped out, holding a shotgun. Marvin instantly froze, realizing who he was dealing with. "You destroyed my child's life!" Joshua shouted angrily, raising the barrel of the gun. "You took my grandson from me." Marvin, raising his hands, tried to calm him down. "Please, listen. I meant no harm. I realize I did wrong, but Joshua would not listen. The thought of his daughter's shame, of the abortion, of the future taken away from her, was pulsating madly in his mind. Anger mixed with pain and thirst for revenge. "You know how I raised her," he wheezed, "and you ruined it all." Marvin slowly backed away, confused, searching for a way to explain himself or to escape. But at that very moment, a shot rang out, instantly shattering the night silence. The bullet pierced the pastor's chest. He staggered, tried to say something, and fell before his heart could take another beat. The neighbors heard the shot and ran out of their homes. Some shouted for someone to call the police, while others watched in fear as Joshua stood over the motionless body, still clutching the gun. A few minutes later, police arrived with their sirens blaring. The man did not run away, staying in place as if petrified, with an expression of absolute rage that he had already unleashed. The news of Pastor Marvin's murder stunned the town. People who knew him as a good-natured and inspirational preacher could not believe this bloody tragedy. The police quickly found out the details. Witnesses heard Joshua mention his daughter's pregnancy by the pastor in the forced abortion, and a crying Sabrina confirmed that she had had an intimate relationship with him, became pregnant, and he insisted on terminating the pregnancy. Upon learning of this, the father grabbed a gun and went to restore justice. This story caused a wide response. Newspapers were full of loud headlines such as "Pastor and Schoolgirl Destroyed Lives" or "Father Took the Law into His Own Hands." The town was hotly debating the incident. Some justified the father's actions, while others called him a real murderer. However, the law was clear. He had committed premeditated murder. Joshua's family home was at the epicenter of the reporter's attention. Sabrina couldn't take a step without risking being filmed, and her mother tried to somehow protect her daughter from the pesky journalists. Everyone was waiting for an explanation, and the town was divided in their assessments of what had happened. Some called the pastor a sinner, while others considered the father's action too cruel. Weeks had passed since Joshua's arrest, but for Sabrina, those days were a blur. It was like a nightmare. Her father was behind bars, Pastor Marvin was dead, and she was left with a sense of guilt and pain. Carol, the mother, tried her best to support her daughter, but she herself could hardly withstand the pressure from the press, law enforcement, and the community. The investigation continued, and soon the case was brought to court. Joshua's defense attorney was Attorney Gray, a short but charismatic man who often represented people who committed crimes under the influence of strong emotions. The prosecutor was Mrs. Berg, an implacable and principled woman who insisted that the crime had been carefully planned. The first hearings gave the following picture. The mother and daughter told how Sabrina had been hiding an affair with the pastor and had agreed to an abortion under pressure. When Joshua found out about it, he grabbed a gun and actually committed a lynching. The prosecutors had eyewitness accounts that showed him standing guard outside the church, lying in ambush. The press relished the details. Some articles praised the father, saying that he just snapped out of his grief, while others wrote about the cold-blooded murder. The trial began a few months later, and the courtroom could barely accommodate everyone: journalists, concerned residents, and the pastor's family. Sabrina and Carol sat in the front rows, confused, trying not to meet the eyes of the public. Joshua walked out with the escort, his expression blank but focused at the same time. His eyes never left his daughter. Prosecutor Berg emphasized in her opening statement, the defendant, having learned what happened to his daughter, decided to kill a person instead of going to the police. He deliberately went there with a weapon and prepared an ambush. This qualifies as aggravated murder. Gray's lawyer countered, my client is a father who loves his daughter dearly, and he was in a state of severe nervous breakdown when he learned of such a terrible insult against a minor. In such an emotional storm, he could not think rationally, let alone coldly calculate. Sabrina had to testify in court, and it turned out to be an extremely difficult ordeal. She was forced to tell in public in detail about her affair with the pastor, her pregnancy, and her abortion. The room was filled with tense silence, with only a few restrained sighs and muffled whispers. The prosecutor ruthlessly asked painful questions. Why didn't you go to the police when the pastor was trying to get you to have intimate relations? Do you realize that this is not only morally unacceptable, but also against the law on his part? Sabrina repeated in few words that she was afraid, did not want to ruin the pastor's reputation, and above all, she was terrified of her father's anger. When the lawyer representing Joshua's interests took the stand, he tried to prove that his father had acted in a state of sudden emotional outburst after learning of the betrayal of his own principles. In turn, the mother, Carol, said, my husband found out everything at once. He was torn with pain and shame. He kept repeating, how could this happen in our family? Nevertheless, neighbors said they saw Joshua sitting in the car for a long time waiting for the pastor, which indicated a pre-planned ambush. The prosecutor emphasized that he deliberately took the gun, checked the ammunition, and probably knew when the pastor was leaving the church. All of this looked more like a well-thought-out act of revenge than a momentary lapse in judgment. The trial lasted several weeks. Psychologists were invited. The state of effect, or recklessness, was discussed, and the prosecutor insisted on sober and cold intent. All the residents of the town followed every step of the process with anxiety. Eventually, the jury left for deliberations, and the hours that passed while they waited were the most anxious. Sabrina sat in the courtroom with her head down, thinking about how things might have turned out if she hadn't taken that gamble or stopped in time. Her mother was holding her hand as if to give her a little bit of support. When the judge finally announced that Joshua was guilty of premeditated murder, the room was frozen in tense silence. Although the judge noted that he took into account the emotional state and circumstances of the crime, the act itself remained too grave. As a result, the father was sentenced to, say, 10 years in prison. Sabrina felt as if something had broken inside her. She was losing her father at once, and she had already lost her pastor and the child she was unable to carry. Everything around her seemed to be falling apart. As Joshua was being led out of the room, his eyes rested on his daughter for a second. In his eyes, she saw not only blind rage, but also deep sadness. He reached out with his hand as if to call out to her or touch her, but the guards hurried him along, and so he left, leaving behind a pang of bitterness. Sabrina sat numbly on the bench, staring into space. A reporter walked by and said quietly, "This is the end. The father is in jail, the pastor is dead, and this girl is now with a broken destiny." Although these words were not addressed to her, she heard them clearly, and they struck her painfully in the heart. After the verdict, the town discussed the outcome for several weeks. Some complained that 10 years was too short for murder, while others argued that Joshua was simply defending the child's honor. However, no one doubted that it was a great tragedy for the family. The mother, Carol, went back to work and struggled to keep the house, and Sabrina had to complete her studies under scrutiny. She was either pitied or judged. Her friends wanted to give her a shoulder to cry on, but they couldn't find the right words. After some time passed and when the passions had calmed down a bit, Sabrina decided to step on the threshold of the church again, the same one where she had once listened to Marvin's inspiring sermons. Everything was different now. Empty pews, semi-darkness, and dim light coming through the stained glass windows. The girl walked quietly between the rows, imagining him standing at the altar looking at her. Their conversations after youth gatherings, the first moments of their reckless flirtation, and their passionate encounters came to mind. And immediately I remembered the day when everything came crashing down like a bad dream. Pregnancy, abortion, the tragedy with her father. Tears rolled down her face and she didn't fight them away. Fragments of the past echoed in her head. "I'll lose everything if they find out about this," Marvin repeated back then. And now it seemed everything was lost for good, Sabrina thought. She knelt down at the altar, though she didn't feel the faith she once had. It was more a step of despair and faint hope that some invisible force would hear her suffering. "Forgive me, God," she whispered quietly, not knowing to whom these words were directed. To herself, to the memory of Marvin, or to heaven itself. As she remained in this oppressive silence, she painfully realized that the clock could not be turned back. Her child was gone, her father was in prison, and her pastor was no longer alive. She would have to move on with the wounds in her soul. It is said that after severe trials, sometimes new strength or understanding is born. Perhaps someday she will find the courage to forgive her father, to forgive the pastor, and to forgive herself. But for now, she just sat there in the emptiness of the old church, full of silent repentance, realizing that all the consequences of our choices never disappear without a trace, but can painfully weigh on our fates.